So I'm going to try something different for my design diary today. Rather than doing it as a textual thing, I'm going to kind of walk through my thought process and sort of how this went visually. Hopefully this was interesting. So what's the problem I'm trying to solve today? So specifically, I'm trying to work out how to allow the user to quickly transition between the map and the workouts metrics view in the Pedometer++ watch app. So you have the map view here on the left, metrics view on the right. And right now, the only way to switch between them is to go into settings, change your chosen workout setting, and then come back, which is awkward. On the Apple Watch Ultra, this is actually something that's pretty straightforward. I can solve this using the action button. The action button is perfect for something like this because I can just sort of, if you push that button and it will go to show whichever display you're not doing. It gets out of your way. That takes no UI. Like this is, I think, what the action button is like made for, is being able to do this kind of toggling behavior. You could do this without really looking. It works really great. But what do I do with other watches? What can I do in other places? So the first thing I thought about is treating it kind of like I did the other buttons on the map view, where there's buttons at the bottom of the map. And right now there's the sort of settings button on the left and the follow your location button on the right. And I could add another button there and that would work. And I think visually look pretty good. But I ran into a lot of challenge when I started thinking about that, of what it looks like on the metrics view. I think ideally I would have both modes have the button in the same place, would have the button in a place that made sense for both. And kind of from a muscle memory perspective, if you're doing a quick check, there's just one place to tap. And so I don't think putting it somewhere like this actually would work in practice. So I needed to find some other sort of space. And so I look to the top left corner and realize maybe this is where I can put it. Maybe I could put a button up here instead and use that as the place to toggle. And this actually works reasonably well in terms of it. I think it's space that isn't otherwise used, but it's really complicated to use that space because just putting a single button kind of up there feels really small, feels kind of orphaned from the rest of the design, especially on the metrics view. And the distance label now feels really out of alignment, where I have the text at the top saying how far you've been on the map is really hard to see. And initially when I built this, I just did it as a button, and I found that was really hard to push for obvious reasons. It's a tiny screen and in a tiny sort of the top corner. And it slightly benefits from being in the corner, which makes it a little easier to tap. But overall, this is getting in the right direction, but definitely not quite there. So the next thing I did was to see, well, what if I just make the whole top of the app tappable? So if you imagine the blue area here at the top is completely tappable in all of the views, and potentially either in the metrics view showing the icon or not, potentially just as a way to get around that kind of orphaned UI element perspective. If I just make the whole thing tappable, that works. And this is definitely getting in the right direction. I think this is much better from a layout perspective and makes good use of this dead space on the screen. But I realized there was, so thinking about something I remember reading in the human interface guidelines, specifically in the color section, where it says, use pure black for your app's background. Pure black, that's 000 hex, blends seamlessly with the Apple Watch's bezel and creates the illusion of an edgeless screen. So I can put a button up there, but I shouldn't make it, I can't make it visible like this by putting this blue thing on the outside, because it kind of really ruins this edge-to-edge thing. And obviously in the maps view, I have content that fills the whole screen, so it's a slightly different thing. But in this view, it just really doesn't work. And I think it ruins that feeling of having an Apple Watch screen that goes all the way to the top. I think it's also kind of undiscoverable in the sense of, if I did it without the icon, which I think visually was more compelling, it's, you don't know that it's tappable other than that it's blue, and then it's just kind of awkward and doesn't work great. So instead, I thought, well, let's see, what if I can put a regular button is? So the first thing I did is just take one of the other buttons that I had from before and put it up there. And as you can see, a circular button is not going to work up there. It's just visually too heavy and just doesn't fit in there. It fits in well on a map, but it doesn't fit in well here. And so instead, I'm going to do something, I think, kind of more oblong, more kind of in fitting with the space that I have, something that would fit well next to the time, so that they kind of are slightly more harmonious. There's this sense of kind of width, but a bit short on height. And how does this look then on the map view, which is where it's things get a little bit more interesting. it works actually pretty well. And I think it works as long as I make it really rounded. And so I changed from the kind of round rect to the capsule shape to make it be slightly more harmonious with the circular buttons in the bottom. And just as a note here, the red box you can see up there is actually the tappable area of the button. The visual part is just the part in blue, but I wanted to make the whole thing tappable because it's still kind of small. And if I just make the blue part tappable, it's very below the 44-point guideline that we're typically trying to hit for button size. This is close to that. I think it's actually something like 38 points or 40 points. So it's close, but not perfect. But in practice, I found it actually works reasonably well, especially because it's much wider than that. I think it's about 64 to 64-ish points wide, so it's a pretty big tappable area. And because it's in the corner, there's a little bit of kind of indexing your finger will naturally do, which I found made it still pretty tappable. And this actually worked really well. I like this look, and if I make it so that the button kind of will expand to fit whatever the content of this is, it actually, I think, looks visually pretty well. And if you've gone for a very long hike, the button would just get wider and wider. And I think it sort of works reasonably well harmoniously with putting the time up there as well. Something that's probably worth saying, getting the alignment of this in these screenshots kind of doesn't look quite right, because in each of these devices there's a masking that happens. The corners aren't actually round, and so that's why it looks a little bit funny. But in practice, I can tell you that it actually looks good when the devices are masked, and you can kind of get a sense between the different, the Ultra, the 44mm, and the 40mm, how I have to adjust the spacing and padding of things to make it kind of look good visually. But I think this design works really well. And then the last thing I needed to do was to go back to the metrics view and tweak the way this button looks. I think it made a lot of sense to make it green, in terms of like when you hit the green button, you go to the map. When you hit the blue button, you go to the metrics, which is consistent with the way it's kind of indexed in the settings area. And also, rather than having the map itself be white, I decided to make it black and kind of make it, I guess, sort of the negative button in that way, just because visually it feels much lighter, and I think it promotes visually the actual content of the display, so that the time, distance, heart rate, all those kind of measures stand out, and this button is visible but doesn't kind of dominate it visually. And so this is kind of the result if I want to kind of show it to you in practice. So if you have that button up there, you can switch between your map view, interact with any of them as you would, and anytime you tap it, it'll just sort of jump back and forth between it. I've tried this in practice, and it works really well, and I'm very pleased with the result. Anyway, hopefully that was an interesting way for me to kind of talk this through rather than writing it out. If you like these kind of things, please do let me know.